In his latest book titled Wasteland, author Robert Kaplan focuses on the importance of technology on determining the world's future. Kaplan, author of 24 books, holds a chair in geopolitics at the Foreign Policy Institute. In the chapter number 3 in his 177-page book, Kaplan claims, quote, civilization is now in flux. The ongoing decay of the West is manifested not only in racial tensions, coupled with new barriers to free speech, but in the deterioration of dress codes, the erosion of grammar, the decline in sales of serious books and classical music, and so on, all of which have traditionally been signs of civilization. Robert Kaplan, in your new book called Wasteland, you run a quote at the beginning of the book from a gentleman named Roger Scruton. Correct me if that's not the right pronunciation. And the quote is, hope, detached from faith and untempered by the evidence of history, is a dangerous asset and one that threatens not only those who embrace it, but all those within range of their illusions. Explain why you use that at the start of your book.
Well, first of all, Roger Scruton was a great British conservative philosopher who died only in the last few years. Very controversial, very conservative, but absolutely brilliant, especially about architecture. He hates modern architecture. In that sense, he's along with King Charles, and what he's basically saying is that hope, optimism in international affairs is fine, provided it's grounded in analysis and facts. But if it's just in order to be polite, if you're just sounding optimistic about a situation just so as not to offend someone, that could lead to real damage. And in fact, as I wrote in a previous book where you had me on, The Tragic Mind, the wisest among us are full of fear, and fear is future oriented. And therefore, what Scruton is saying is think tragically in order to avoid tragedy.
The title of this book is Wasteland. Where did that title come from?
It came from, of course, T.S. Eliot's famous poem of 1922 entitled The Wasteland. And it was a phenomenon. It was even people who don't understand it know about it. It's almost infused itself into the popular culture. And it was basically about, and again, people argue about the meaning of its lines. A lot of it seems incomprehensible. But what it's basically about is the passing of the old world after World War I and a new world which is fragmented, disjointed. It's almost as if you're in a place where people are speaking a foreign language and you do not understand it. So it's not necessarily negative, and it's not necessarily about anarchy. But what it is about is we're in a world where nothing fits together, where there's constant churn, constant turmoil. The cities are becoming more and more soulless, and it's metaphorically a wasteland.
You write a lot. You've written lots of books. What was it that triggered your interest in this specific book?
In this book, first of all, the title I had was The World in a Permanent Crisis. I didn't come up with Wasteland immediately. Someone else, my literary agent said, why not just call it Wasteland, because you write about T.S. Eliot in the book. It came to me gradually, like all of us, when we have an idea, especially an extended idea, we start taking notes. And we start taking furious notes. It's time to write. Or, if not a long essay, then a short book or something like that. And I saw what really triggered it was I realized we're always in a crisis of some sorts. The headlines are always screaming. But there's a logic to it. And the logic has to do with geography has been shrunken by technology, but not completely defeated. So we're in a smaller, more claustrophobic and anxious world. And that's basically what triggered it.
3 chapters. The first one is about the Weimar Republic. Why? What was it?
Because the Weimar Republic, which lasted from at the end of World War I, 1919 to be precise, to 1933 when Hitler came to power in January of 1933, was basically an attempt at of forming a democracy in Germany that was stable, that would not give in to the tyranny of the Kaiser or something like that. And what it turned into quickly was a very loose-limbed, very poorly organized, unstable system that hung together but just barely. And what I'm saying in this book is it's a metaphor for our world at large. And that's because of the shrinkage of geography. We may not have a global government, but we are part of the same world. We have some of the same issues: climate change, disease. Great power conflicts can now start in one part of the world and ricochet to another part of the world. We've never had a time where a crisis in one place can affect crises in other places and ignite them. So it's sort of like one big Weimar. But what I'm careful to tell the reader is the Weimar Republic did not have to end with Hitler. There were quite a few other alternatives. It just didn't happen that way. And therefore, by comparing the world to the Weimar Republic, at least in my mind, it's not a doom and gloom metaphor.
Where was the Weimar Republic? Was it physically the capital of Germany at the time?
No, the Weimar Republic is called such because the Constitution was drawn up in the Thuringen city of Weimar, which is in central Germany. I visited it once as a student in East Germany. It was in southwestern East Germany. Beautiful town associated with Goethe and Schiller and others. And so it was always referred to as the Weimar Republic because that's where the system was invented. But the capital was Berlin.
In that chapter, you write, Vladimir Putin has been the most dangerous Russian leader since Stalin. Xi Jinping is as relentless and ideological as Mao Zedong. Donald Trump, whose political career may lie in the past tense, and you wrote this obviously before the election,
Sure,
is more vain and superficial than von Papen even. And I just start with that. Who was von Papen?
Yes, von Papen was one of the last leaders of the Weimar Republic. He was extremely superficial, unknowing, a true mediocrity who made a couple of moves that were instrumental in bringing Hitler to power. He was completely in over his head. And there was a great German historian, Golo Mann, the son of the Nobel Prize winner, Thomas Mann. And Golo Mann wrote that if such a superficial, inconsequential character as von Papen could determine the history of the 20th century, because he helped bring Hitler to power, there's no meaning in history. There's no, everything is contingencies, essentially. And so I compared Trump to von Papen, and you're right, this book, obviously, like all books, was finished many months ago. And I had no idea who would win the presidential election. And so let's start with Putin. The Soviets had a lot of leaders who were, the thing about the Soviet Union was it was led by men who were inherently conservative and risk averse. Because after all, these were the men who had survived Stalin's purges. And how did you survive Stalin's purges? By having an opinion on nothing, essentially. So that Brezhnev, Kosygin, Podgorny, all these people, in the Soviet Union, in the 70s, 80s, in the 70s and 80s, were very risk averse and conservative, even though they were nominally Marxists, essentially. And they had tight bureaucratic controls all around them, because the Soviet Politburo leader ran a Politburo, which meant it was a collegial system where everyone had to agree on most things. And if somebody made a bad move, like get into a crisis that was unnecessary, like Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they were removed from power. Khrushchev was removed in 1964 after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So Putin is without restraint. He's without all these guardrails and restraints that the Soviet leadership after Stalin basically had. Xi Jinping is an ideological Leninist authoritarian. Remember, for decades, China was a risk-averse, collegial, semi-capitalistic system. It was an authoritarian, nominally communist system that had friends in Washington. It had friends in the White House, on Capitol Hill, in the media. That all has changed with Xi, where China has no friends left anywhere, because he's really made the conflict, or the rivalry, between the U.S. and China very ideological.
How does Donald Trump fit into your thesis in this book now?
Well, again, writing it, I had no idea he would be reelected. I just tried to hedge it, as we tried to do. But Trump is very, for instance, with Greenland and Panama, he probably doesn't mean that he's going to invade Greenland or Panama. He probably means the Danes are not doing nearly enough for Greenland security close to the major submarine routes of Russia, or that the Panamanians are not giving U.S. ships a better deal than they are. But he doesn't say that. He talks about taking it over. That kind of loose-limbed rhetoric can really get in trouble and spark a major crisis.
I heard you recently say that you compared W with his father and his brother, and you said had his brother become the former governor of Florida, become president, it would have been a much better presidency than George W. Why did you say that?
Yeah, I said that because, one of the things in this book is that, it has a geographical orientation, the Weimar Republic as the greater world, but it's not completely geographically fatalistic. It's about personalities and how personalities change history and contingencies. And W was chosen, as I write in the book, after the end of the Cold War, but before 9/11. It was sort of an interregnum where not much seemed to be at stake. And had the Cold War still been going on, or had 9/11 already happened, it's very possible W would not have been chosen as the Republican Party nominee or be elected president. And, I talked about Jeb Bush in this sense. If we had the primary system, if we had the party system we had in earlier decades, where the party leaders in smoke-filled rooms decided the nominees, Trump never would have been the nominee in 2016. It would have been Jeb Bush, who, as I pointed out, would have been more like his father than like his brother.
Tell us why you like his father.
I thought his father was great, was one of the, I would call him the second best one-term president in American history. The best was James Polk, because he increased the size of the United States by 40% in one term, essentially. And it was the most vigorous presidency between Jackson and Lincoln, essentially. The father, it wasn't great things that he did, it's all the terrible things that did not happen because of his decisions. He did not gloat or go on a victory lap when communist regimes were falling throughout Eastern Europe. He stayed quiet because he saw it was a close run thing about the Soviets militarily intervening and causing a lot of bloodshed. So he didn't want to gloat. He went, he initiated a war against Saddam Hussein, but did not go to Baghdad. When Tiananmen Square happened, and many people were calling for him to break relations with China, he did not. He lowered relations, but he kept the relationship going. And in fact, after Tiananmen, in the wake of Tiananmen, is when the Chinese economy exploded and hundreds of millions of people entered the middle class.
In our last conversation, and by the way, for those interested, this is be far different than that one. It's episode 118 of our podcast, and it was done on June 13th, 2023. You told us then that you've lived in Greece, lived in Portugal, lived in Israel, married a Portuguese woman or a woman from Portugal, and you live in the Berkshires. Is this all still the same story? Are you still there in the Berkshires?
Yes. I'm still in the Berkshires. The point is, I'm not in Washington or New York, so I have a lot of extra time to read, and this book is sort of like a result of that.
One thing you mentioned, I think, 3 different times, and I think it's maybe a metaphor for the book, and I'll go to page 142, and all I'll say is I'll mention the name Tom Cotton and let you tell the story, why it's in your book.
Yes. Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed for the New York Times in 2020. This was during the George Floyd demonstrations, urban riots, etc. At the time, Tom Cotton was being mooted as a possible presidential candidate. And he wrote an op-ed saying that federal troops might be employed to quell the riots. Now, this was significant because at the time he was a possible presidential candidate. And the New York Times, regardless of its own point of view, often publishes the opinion of people extremely influential, even when they disagree with it, so to speak. And the editors of the op-ed page of the opinion section, James Bennett, who is the opinion editor, and James Dow, who is the specific op-ed editor, chose to publish it. And the result was what I call in the book a movement of the crowd, like an uprising from below rather than from above, an uprising because of social media. One of the things I spend a lot of time at in the book is saying we used to have tyranny from above only in the 20th century during the industrial age, terrible regimes, Stalin, Mao, Hitler, etc. But with the internet, you can have a tyranny from below come, a crowd formation from below. And and there was this movement of young New York Times staffers demanding literally the heads of Bennett and Dow for publishing this article, this op-ed. And they were Dow was transferred to the Metropolitan page of the Times, and Bennett resigned. And the result, and the reason I include this story was this is an example of what of the kind of tyranny from below or movement from below that now works together with tyranny and movements from above, because we're in the post-industrial revolution. So, and also, this occurred during the coronavirus lockdown, when people couldn't get a chance to meet as much as they might have in person. So it was driven completely by the internet, by people who were isolated in their own apartments, and this had this had an effect as well.
What's happened? I've got a number of people that I know that have said to me, I won't read the New York Times anymore. And this happened in the last couple of years, right around the time that all this started to happen, the George Floyd situation. What put the New York Times in perspective? Because I know you talk about it more than once in this book. How important is it to the country?
Yeah. I one of the things in this book that I mention is America was a great power in the greater print and typewriter age. And the print and typewriter age, because it published long articles which were fact-checked and had professional editing, basically rewarded moderate, complex thinking. And that affected our national life. But in the digital video era, after all, you can't even imagine Donald Trump except in the digital video era. In the digital video era, this moderation and complexity of thought has given way to emotion and shouting and extremes, so that there's less and less of a center in American democracy and more of right-left extremes. And the media has been affected by this. You have the New York Times has moved towards the progressive left, and Fox News is an example of major television media moving to the right. Now, I'm careful to point out that the New York Times is far, far more professional in just so many ways than Fox News. But nevertheless, there is this phenomena of the center being lost, and I attributed it in the book partially to technology, because the change in technology.
What are your daily habits when it comes to wanting to stay up with the world?
Well, what I do is I get up in the morning on a normal weekday when I'm not traveling, and there's a lap pool very near where we live, and I swim a mile every morning. I used to be a competitive swimmer when I was in grade school. And then I come in and I eat breakfast and I write till about noon, then have a short nap and edit and do research in the afternoon.
What do you read and watch to keep up with the world?
Well, what I do a lot of skimming. I find that what's called the legacy media often often picks up on a subject after it's obvious, not before it's obvious. Like you could be talking for years and years and writing for years and years, as I have been, about Eurasia, but the legacy media only discovers it recently, basically. And for the Navy, we have been in a naval crisis. We've gone from counterinsurgency to high-end naval strategic conflict for many years. The New York Times only started covering it after it had been happening for about half a decade already. So you need to skim the Times and the Post and the Journal just to find out what's going on today. But what I find is there are a lot of smaller publications that may be less professional, maybe less well edited, but which are ahead of the curve, because their writers simply lack the writing ability, but they're very good analysts, and they don't know how to break into the legacy media.
Can you give me an example?
Well, if you look at realclearworld.com in the morning, it's sort of the old Reader's Digest format. In the print and typewriter age, the Reader's Digest, they'd have about 30 articles a month of the best articles. They called it an article a day in permanent booklet form, kind of. Well, Real Clear basically takes op-eds and essays from around the world of varying qualities having to do with geopolitics, foreign affairs, and they run about 15 of them every day. I mean, they have links to 15 of them every day. And you can also often tell just by the headlines what they're about, but there's always 2 or 3 which are very good and ahead of the curve.
In your book, you wrote, "The money culture of bankers, stockbrokers, real estate entrepreneurs, media moguls, and their like go hand in hand with the overseas adventure of imperialism, which together signify the end of the West.
Yes, this is in the context. I'm writing a lot. I introduced the reader to a number of thinkers, and one of them is I'm having a brain freeze at the moment.
I'm glad to know that somebody besides me has those.
I'm interested to the person who wrote The Decline of the West.
I've got it listed. Go ahead and talk about it, and I'll get the. It's
right, yeah.
Oswald Spengler.
Oswald Spengler, who published The Decline of the West in two parts in 1918 and 1922. And basically, he describes Western civilization as, like all previous civilizations, as something that's born, grows up, matures, and dies. Sort of like the lifestyle, sort of like, the pattern of an individual. Now, Spengler was not original in this. There was also a great Arab philosopher of the 13th century, Ibn Khaldun, who talked about it in a slightly different way, where the Bedouin take over a city, become very wealthy and sophisticated and lose their Bedouin habits, and then are overtaken by a new group of invading Bedouin, after several hundred years. And these are the cycles of history. And what Spengler is saying is that, the West has become so sophisticated, so wealthy, so mature, that its power extends around the world. It has interests throughout the world, and that leads to overseas adventures. Nobody invents imperialism in a dark room. It's a gradual process. With America, it began, one could argue, during the Spanish-American War in 1898. Or certainly we've been an empire, if not in name, since 1945. And so, wealth and overseas adventures in Spengler's long-spanning view go together.
I made a list of 30 books that you refer to in some form or another in your book. And it was, it sent me to the Google, as you would say, to get some background on a lot of them. But some of them, of course, I was familiar with. But I want to ask you about them and how much you then know about them or research them. Top of the list is Robert Conquest, and The Harvest of Sorrow is the book you quote from. Why Robert Conquest, and who was he?
Yeah, Robert Conquest was a poet and an analyst, which normally don't go together. He was British. And he wrote about what he called the Ukrainian terror famine. He published a book, The Harvest of Sorrow. I read it in 1985. It was published sometime around then. And it was about it was about Stalinism, essentially. As Stalinism was founded on totality, an individual was not allowed to have a private thought, but it was also founded on imperialism, and on forcing subject peoples into submission through famine. Later on, the very well-noted historian Anne Applebaum wrote a book about the Ukrainian famine. But this, Conquest's book came out in 1985. And, the point is that, the point is I'm writing about totalitarian systems, and specifically the danger of communism, which later on I go on in the book to say we have not completely defeated yet.
Barbara Tuchman, Guns of August.
Yes, Barbara Tuchman was the greatest American popular historian of the 20th century. The word popular has to be in quotes, because it would seem when I use the term that she was not altogether serious. But in fact, it's the opposite. She was deeply learned, deeply well-read, but did not have a specialty. She wrote about China often. She wrote about Europe often. She wrote The March of Folly about getting into unnecessary wars. She wrote about the Middle Ages. And her erudition and her span was immense. And she comes up in the book because I'm writing about World War One and how World War One started on contingencies with the Battle of Tannenberg, which she writes about in The Guns of August, and about how the Battle of Tannenberg was a disaster for the Tsar, and that led in turn to the abdication of the Tsar, and that led in turn over time to the Bolshevik Revolution, where tens of millions of people were killed. So it's about how history lies on a thread.
Number 3 on my list is Henry Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams and the son, I guess, of Charles Francis Adams. But you write about the education of Henry Adams. What's that?
Yes. The Education of Henry Adams was published in 1907 privately, but publicly, I think, in 1918, the year of his death. In Henry Adams's book, and I believe he was a secretary to his father, the U.S. ambassador to Britain, Charles Francis Adams, when he got this perception. He said the whole problem of Europe and European security, this is 1907 he's writing this, all boils down to Russia. Russia's always been the big thing that Europe could not digest. It wasn't, it was too big, too Asiatic, too Eurasian, too unstable to fit within the tidy democratic systems or liberal systems of Central and Western Europe. And he said the highest triumph of history would be incorporating Russia into what he called the Atlantic Combine, meaning the Atlantic world. And I consider that a very prescient observation, because, of course, this was before World War I when he wrote this. And, of course, the World War I brought us the Bolshevik Revolution, which changed Europe, changed the world. And then World War II brought us Great Russian domination of the eastern half of Europe. And that continued up through 1989. Then in the 90s, we had an interregnum when Russia was weak, I go into. But now since Putin consolidated power in what we'll call the later 2000s, Russia is back to where Henry Adams called it, basically the big problem of Europe.
In our last discussion, we talked about your dinner meetings at Henry Kissinger's house in Connecticut. Since then, he has passed, but you talked about being a friend of his. What's the way you use him in your book now?
Kissinger doesn't really appear in Wasteland all that much. I believe I used him when in his book Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. All right. In Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, here is Kissinger in his 30s, in his early mid-30s. It's the 1950s. And the U.S. is all caught up in the danger of thermonuclear war with hydrogen bombs. And here's Kissinger, the young Kissinger, saying, wait a minute, what is far more likely is a war that's conventional, but which later on introduces the weaker side, or the losing side introduces low-yield tactical nuclear weapons, which would be introduced as a surprise at the worst possible moment, where we have no concept of how to react to it. And that's the real danger. Now, if you look forward to India-Pakistan wars, where Pakistan is traditionally the weaker power and the most likely to use nukes, and then you look at President Putin during the Ukraine invasion, the very idea that Putin said, by the way, we do have low yield tactical nuclear weapons, probably caused the Biden administration to become far, far more conservative and hesitant in arming the Ukrainians, arming them enough to hold off against Russia, but not to win the war. So that, as Kissinger pointed out, and others have since, nuclear weapons have always been used. We're still using them, as a form of coercion and leverage. And that's why the Iranians want nukes. It's why Kim Jong-un has nukes, not to actually detonate them, but to protect the regime and to use them as leverage. As I point out in the book, had Gaddafi kept his weapons of mass destruction, we may not have helped topple him.
I'm not sure how to ask this, but do you miss those dinners with Henry Kissinger?
Sure, I miss them. Of course you miss them, but all things pass. He lived to be 100. So, one cannot complain. And he was very, very lucid up until the last 6 months of his life.
How do you read a book? And when we see the quotes in a book like this, have you written them down? Do you have a system?
Yeah, I do have a system. It's probably similar to many other writers. I read a book, and at the back of each book is just a white page. It's empty, usually. And every time I see a quote or an idea that I say, this is brilliant, but I'll forget it if I don't write it down, I make a note, the page number, and I summarize the idea in a few words. And then by the time I finish the book, if it's a very good book, that whole white page is filled. And sometimes, the white page inside is filled as well. And so when I go back to that book, I look at the back, I look at the white pages, and they're like trigger words. It comes back to you.
Another person that is somewhat prominent in your book is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. You write about the Red Wheel series. Explain who he was and how long did he live in Vermont?
Yeah. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was not just one of the great writers of the 20th century, but one of the great men of the 20th century. He was a traditional conservative, which meant that he wanted the Tsar to survive. Even as a great writer, he recognized all the iniquities of the Tsar. He felt that there was no other alternative. He believed that of the two Russian revolutions of 1917, the first was the more tragic, the one that overthrew the Tsar and brought Kerensky to power, Alexander Kerensky, who was a politician at the time, who was completely in over his head. And that led to anarchy. And the anarchy meant that power was literally lying in the streets to be picked up. And a very tenuous contingent Bolshevik coup d'etat happened, and that led to everything else. Solzhenitsyn, has the scope of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. He knows about everything from the stars in the sky to Orthodox saints to battlefield formations. He's truly epic in his knowledge. And he came out of the Soviet Union shortly after winning the Nobel Prize. He was exiled by the communists. And imagine being a Nobel Prize winner, a literary intellectual. He would have been feted and celebrated at dinner parties in Paris and Washington and New York, and he gave all that up. He retired to Vermont, to a place called Cavendish, Vermont, which replicated to some degree the Russian landscape, the Russian forest. It was absolutely isolated, snowy, a cold climate. And he just wrote and wrote for the better part of 2 decades. And what he wrote was what came to be known as the Red Wheel series, which is somewhat lesser known than his other books. such as the Gulag Archipelago and One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and others. But the Red Wheel series was a history of the Russian Revolution in real time. In other words, history in the present tense. And his point is, hindsight always make things clear that were never clear in the first place. It was just all these human beings acting, and this happened. And he shows how that happened. The titles of the book say it all. August 1914, November 1916, March 1917, of which there are more volumes coming out. They're still being translated by Marion Schwartz and published, but I think by the University of Notre Dame Press. And all of these books are about 750 pages, So this is what he did, isolated, alone, shunning the world in Cavendish, Vermont. And I say this was an act in the spirit of Russia's own Eastern monasticism.
Why did he go back to Russia to die?
He went back. Why did he go back to Russia?
Yeah.
He went back in 2008, I believe, or earlier. I can't remember exactly. But, after the communists were overthrown, there was stability. He came back. And I believe when he came back, he decided to go back via the Trans-Siberian Railroad. He wanted to approach Moscow and Petersburg from the east, essentially. And he was celebrated, feted in Russia. But to me, the great thing about his life was he gave up. He gave up all this celebration and all this great lifestyle of everyone telling him how brilliant he was in the most fashionable capitals, and went to live in Vermont.
Two well-known books. People have read them all my life. Huxley's Brave New World, George Orwell's 1984. Why do you use those in your book?
Because they basically describe a world where there is no past, where it's all the present, where everything is rewritten according to the values of the present moment, not to the values of the people who actually experienced life 100 years ago and 200 years ago. And that, in Orwell's mind, was the greatest tyranny. That's how you erase history, by judging people totally on present day values rather than values of the past. And Huxley was more about how we would all be able to deal with this endless present by a cocktail of medications and drugs, essentially, that would make us all normal, so to speak. So they caught something, in terms of the direction that the world was going. And that's what led to, to the immense popularity of these brilliant books.
Which one would you read first?
I would read 1984. 1984 is just, I consider it the more brilliant of the two. There are just parts in it. For instance, when one of the characters says, one of the things, I fear in this book that I talk about is the third section is called Crowds and Chaos, that there's nothing more tyrannical than the crowd, which can be a mob, which can be various things. And he has one character say, always yell with the crowd, no matter how nonsensical it is. Just always agree with the crowd, whatever the crowd is thinking, and you'll be safe.
Elias Canetti talking about crowds, the crowds and power.
Yes, Crowds and Power, I believe, was published in German in 1960 when he wrote the book. He was a Nobel Prize winner. I believe he won the Nobel Prize in 1981. He was a Sephardic Jew, born in Bulgaria, who lived in Vienna and saw saw the frightening crowds of anarchy in mid-1930s Vienna, which led to the Nazi takeover, and it scared the daylights out of him. And he talks about crowd formations, how the original crowd formation was the hunting pack, running after an animal, a group of hunter-gatherers running after an animal and killing it for food. And he said the history of humanity is the history of crowds. When you read about his tyrannical crowds, like at a public execution, the real executioner is not the person chopping someone's head off or hanging him, but it's the crowd. The crowd is the real executioner. And it's impossible to read these lines without thinking of lynch mobs in the Old South. And he writes about, he said there are different kinds of crowds. Nations are crowds. For Germany, the crowd is the marching forest. For England, the crowd is the sea, is the surrounding sea. And he talks about all different kinds of crowds. He said, and one of the worst crowds is the crowds formed by inflation, because inflation diminishes people's savings. And because it diminishes how much wealth they have, it diminishes them this sense of themselves. And they want to hate and tear to pieces the persons who caused this inflation. And this is how Canetti defines anti-Semitism. After the great inflation that brought Hitler to power. So it's a startling book. I read it for the first time in Stalinist Romania in the 1980s, where, you saw these crowds supporting the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, and it had a deep effect on me.
What's the biggest crowd you've ever been in?
The biggest crowd I've ever been in, in terms of a conventional crowd.
Well, just in thinking of you, if you've ever had the experience of standing in the middle of thousands of people and what you were thinking at the time.
Yes, in Romania, people were shouting "Ceausescu pace," "Ceausescu pace," which means Ceausescu peace, because the propaganda at the time was that Ceausescu was leading humanity to a world of peace and nuclear disarmament, and nirvana.
Who assassinated him?
What?
Who assassinated him?
He wasn't assassinated so much as executed. There's subtle differences here. In fact, I visited the place, Brian, where he was lined up against the wall and shot, him and his wife. It's in Târgoviște, northwest of Bucharest. What happened was the communist revolutions of Eastern Europe, of the fall of 1989. Ceausescu and his wife were toppled, and they made an escape, and they were hunted down in crowd formation. They were captured. There was a quick show trial. It was a show trial. They were tried, convicted, and they were led to a nearby wall, and a very well-trusted squad of soldiers just shot them to death. And this was Christmas Day, 1989.
The next fella I'm going to ask you about it, and you sent me again looking for him talking about his book, was Tom Wolfe and the Painted Word. I found an old firing line with Bill Buckley, but I have to tell you, and this is probably me, I didn't understand a word of what he was talking about. Not Wolfe, but Buckley and his questions about him. So tell me, what was the Painted Word and why did you use it?
Yeah. This comes from Spengler, originally. Because Spengler had this idea of the life and death of civilizations. And Spengler felt that music peaked during Schubert and Mendelssohn in the 19th century, and everything else afterwards, Stephen Sondheim, Rodgers and Hammerstein, were declined. And and this to me shows Spengler's inhuman vision. essentially. And Spengler had a similar thing to say about art. He said all the art schools could be closed, this like in the late, after the Impressionists, that the Impressionists was the last artist, that modern art was nonsense, that it was not tied to the soil, it had no tradition. And I disagreed with Spengler in the book. I talked about Peggy Guggenheim's great Museum of Modern Art in Venice, which I visited. Anyway, because of Spengler's, dismissal of all art beyond the Impressionists, it made me write about Tom Wolfe. Because Tom Wolfe wrote this book, The Painted Word, where he said that modern art is, you see a painting of just a black and a white space and it's worth $30 million. Modern art is a creation of a few artists, intellectuals, and critics, maybe 30 and 40 people or so, who basically decide that this is great and this is what the public must look at. Wolfe was essentially putting it down. He was saying the whole thing was a charade. In effect. And this is probably why he was on Buckley's show, but I didn't see it.
What, by the way, in history of writing and all that, what impact has Tom Wolfe had on us?
Tom Wolfe was a great journalist, number one. He could capture individuals in very vivid, colorful language very quickly. He's been criticized, though, as always staying a journalist, that in his novels, his characters don't develop. Because the art of novel writing is not just to paint, to write a profile of someone. Journalists do that all the time. It's to have that person's personality change through the course of the pages of the book. And that takes real art. That takes a knack almost to do. And he's always been conventionally criticized by saying his characters are just there at the beginning of the book and they don't develop.
I want to go back to the title of your book, Wasteland, and bring up T.S. Eliot. I did go to the poem. I didn't understand a lot of it. I'm beginning to question my ability to decipher all this stuff. But again, who was T.S. Eliot and why was he so important in history?
Yeah, T.S. Eliot was an American. I believe he was born in St. Louis, went to Harvard, but spent most of his life in England and adopted British citizenship, and I believe converted to the Anglican faith from Catholicism. If my memory serves me right. And he wrote a number of great poems: the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Gerontium, Wasteland, and unlike Spengler, Eliot was a real artist. You may not understand all the lines, but it's beautiful to read. And in their very beauty, there's an uplifting aspect to it. Even when he writes about bleak, unreal cities, there's a beauty in the language. Spengler has none of this. Spengler is totally lowering in that sense. And he's best known for a group of poems he wrote in the wake of World War I. Remember, World War I killed almost 20 million people. It devastated Europe. It left people just without any hope. If humanity could do this to itself, if politicians could get involved in such a war, what hope was there for anything? And Eliot wrote a book about, wrote a series of poems about men adjusting to modern life and the difficulty of adjusting to modern technological life. And one of his themes that I get out of it, you can interpret it in many different ways, is that technology is not necessarily good. Technology can lead to many bad things. It can lead to alienation. It could lead to inhumanity. And all this is in Eliot's poetry. And he was, he's wrote a number of things. The minute you read 5 or 8 lines, it's Eliot. It's very distinctive. And there was no poet like him in the 20th century. He so dominates poetry. And The Wasteland was published in 1922, in the very early part of the century.
There's a lot more, and I'll read a bunch of names, and I want you to pick up on one, because we are running out of time, that you would like to talk about. Jane Jacobs, Plutarch, Jean Kirkpatrick, Hannah Arendt, John Reed, Samuel Huntington, Paul Theroux, Thomas Malthus. I could go on. Pick one of those and tell us why you used it.
Well, Jane Jacobs, was a great American-Canadian critic of architecture of cities. And she wrote a great classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And, my book, Wasteland, is divided into three parts. First is making the Weimar analogy for the world today. The second that we haven't spoken about is how all the great powers are in decline at different levels and at different paces, the US, China, and Russia. The third part, though, is about the city. It's about urbanization, how the biggest effect on geopolitics is essentially insidious. It's that humankind is becoming an urban species, and that affects everything. So that leads me to Jane Jacobs. And Jane Jacobs is, sees the city not as a success or a failure, but as a project, something that could be made better. And, and she talks about, it's all about sidewalks. It has nothing to do with the beauty of the big buildings, the snazziness of the restaurants. It's all about sidewalks. Are they filled? Do people walk on them? Are they people of different races and different classes? Do they get along? If the city's sidewalks are interesting, then the city is interesting. That's the basic line of Jane Jacobs. And I end the book, Wasteland, by saying it's a matter of recapturing Jane Jacobs' sidewalk.
You also say on page 42, I do realize how obsessively negative I am being.
Yes, because I realize that there are so many benefits to technology, to post-industrial civilization, in medicine, in engineering, in communications. It's impossible to deny this, but that's not my subject here. My subject is the wisest among us are full of fear. And technology may be postmodern, but it's not necessarily civilized. It doesn't necessarily make us more civilized. And I'm thinking from the point of view of what can go wrong here, of what's actually happening in the world. Why is there a permanent crisis? And that leads to pessimism. But I realize how obsessively pessimistic I'm being, and I end the book saying it's a matter of discovering liberalism, which sounds quaint, but I think in terms of all the evidence I've presented is poignant. And that leads to rediscovering Jane Jacobs' sidewalk.
Define the word liberalism as you used it.
Liberalism?
Mm-hmm.
Liberalism, to me, much greater writers than me have written whole books about it. I mentioned the writers John Stuart Mill, Isaiah Berlin, Edmund Burke. But to me, especially when I'm concerned with the tyranny of the crowd, liberalism to me is about the individual. It's about the sanctity of the individual. It's about respecting the individual. And in a world of electronic hordes, of tweets that go viral, of frenzies, of feeding frenzies, which is all threatens the individual. Liberalism is about, number one, the individual, and it's about being uncertain. It's about, as Leonard Hand, the great American jurist, said, liberals are not sure that they're right. They live in uncertainty, and that leads to an open mind.
Does that term liberalism apply to the liberal conservative arguments that we have today?
Not really, because, Conservatism classically is liberalism, and this distinction is made in Great Britain more than in the United States. Conservatives conserve what is best in liberalism, so that, as Samuel Huntington wrote in The Soldier and the State, the job of a conservative is to prepare for war in order to defend a liberal society.
As we finish up, a couple of quick questions. One, if you had time, what book would you read? Say you have a full day and you want to read something, what would you pick out?
Well, it wouldn't be a book that I could finish in a day. It would take me a few weeks. One of the most challenging books I find is a novel. I've read it twice. I still don't fully understand it. I'll go through it a third time. Is Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Another great novel. I love reading fiction and novel. Is George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, which was about Zionism 20 years before Herzl. That's the amazing thing about that book. It was published in 1876, I thought. It would be returning to fiction because, as I write in this book, it's in the guise of fiction where a writer can more easily tell the truth, because he or she can hide behind make-believe and say, well, I don't believe this. It's just my character who believes it, her saying. So it's easier in fiction to get across ideas than it is in nonfiction.
After people read your book, Wasteland, which one of all the books you write about in your book would you suggest people spend more time with?
Of all the books that I mention in the book that people spend more time with, I would say Solzhenitsyn, August 1914.
And do you have another book coming out in the next year or two?
No, not for at least another year or two.
What are you thinking?
Well, I'm writing a very different kind of book now. It's not abstract. It's not ideas. It's not like The Tragic Mind or this at all. It's a series of profiles of American China experts, of American civilian China experts that goes back 100 years, where China is not the subject of the book. It's sort of like an object. What is it about Chinese culture and language that leads people to become obsessed with specializing in it?
The book, again, is called Wasteland, the subtitle, A World in Permanent Crisis. And our guest is Robert D. Kaplan. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.